In today's Luthier's Quick Tips, I'm going to talk about the fine art of dry sanding. Now, this is a subject I've talked about before in the past, but whenever I come up with new ideas about how to present the information, I'm going to post up a new video. So let's jump in and get started. I use a two-stage process for leveling the top coat of a guitar before I buff it out to a high gloss mirror shine. And the first stage is level sanding, and then the second stage is polish sanding. Level sanding is the most labor intensive, and it actually will involve just one grit of sandpaper, and that is your coarsest grit. And what we're trying to do is get the slightly textured or wavy surface to a perfectly smooth, consistent surface. That's what's going to yield precise and sharply focused reflections. So I'm going to start out with the finest grit that I can get away with and achieve that. And what I've determined I'll use for this body is a P600 grit sandpaper. And the sandpaper that I use is Eagle Abrasives Kovacs, and this is the P600 grit, and this is just aggressive enough to level the surface, but it will take a little bit of elbow grease for that to happen. And I prefer to use a hard block of wood to wrap the sandpaper around in, and then to block sand the surface, and that's what's going to give me that perfectly level surface. Then once I've finished with this grit, I'm going to move on to my polishing grits using Eagle Abrasives Super Aslix, and I'll get to that in a second. But as I'm sanding, it's going to generate a lot of sanding residue powder. And I've got an old cloth here, which is what I will use to wipe off the sandpaper as it builds up with sanding residue. I also have, these are two different sizes of rubber erasers that I got at my local dollar store, and these make great sanding blocks on some of the contoured areas and around some of the curves, because a block doesn't work as well for that. And I use just the small normal size eraser and then one of these larger sizes, and they've got a pretty hard surface, but they have some flexibility. So I'm going to start by sanding the surface, and what I'll use is a kind of a circular sanding stroke, and this is the most aggressive sanding stroke. It'll take off the most material. However, this is the only time that I'll use this sanding stroke. Only during the initial leveling phase with this coarser grit. Once I have moved on to the finer grits, I'll adopt more of a straight sanding stroke that follows the direction of the grain. But this will help me get the surface down level quickly. And what I'm looking for here as I'm sanding, initially the surface starts out kind of with a clear, somewhat glossy appearance, somewhat shiny. As I sand, that shine goes away and it's replaced with sort of a matte sheen, but it becomes much smoother. And that's just because the abrasive grits are dulling the surface that they're sanding. So what you look for are areas where you've got some of that dull sheen, indicating that's where you've been sanding, and then spots where it's shiny. Those are the low spots. So what you're trying to do is eliminate those little shiny spots by sanding the high spots down until you're sanding the entire surface at the same time. And then you'll eliminate those shiny spots, and once that's been accomplished, you have a nice level surface. And then of course, wherever I have these angled contours, I'll use the hard eraser as my sanding block. And of course, there's always the likelihood of having to just use my fingers where I can't get into some of the really tight spots. Obviously, dry sanding generates a lot of dust, so you've got to make sure to clean it off with a soft paper towel every so often. And sharp edges need to be treated with extra care. A light touch and restraint comes in handy here. Once I've finished with the level sanding, I'm ready to move on with polish sanding, and I'll do that with Eagle Abrasive's Super Acelix. And I'm going to be using a soft foam interface pad with a Super Acelix sanding block. And I'll just begin sanding by sanding in the same direction as the grain and using very, very light pressure here. And just as I did when I was level sanding, I'll need to periodically clean the sandpaper by just simply wiping it onto a paper towel. I'll also need to clean the surface on a regular basis as well. And periodically as I'm sanding, I'll stop and then look at the surface at a low angle against a bright light to gauge my progress. What I'm looking for is a consistent reflective surface. To get into the tight spots when I'm polish sanding, I'll use just the foam pad itself with my abrasive sheet instead of attaching the handle. And of course, I'll constantly clean the surface with a clean cloth to remove any sanding residue, which can cause scratches if it builds up too much. And then once I finish with the first grit of Super Acelix, which in this case was 600 grit, I'll move up to 800, repeat the sanding process, and then continue with 1000, 1200, and then 1500 grit. Now the process is exactly the same for all the grits. It's just very light pressure and making sure that I completely clean the surface frequently as I'm sanding. You'll notice as you're polish sanding, when you look at the surface, you can start to see reflections. And the angle that you have to see those reflections changes with the different grits. For example, after sanding with the 600 grit sandpaper, I have to look at the surface at a very sharp angle. But then at 1000 grit, that angle gets a little more shallow. And then finally, when I reach 1500 grit, I can almost look down straight at the body to see the reflections. Since I have a big, powerful buffing machine, I can stop at 1500 grit and buff up the surface to a high gloss shine. However, for those of you who don't have a buffing machine, you're going to probably want to continue to sand to a finer grit. Now, the Super Acelix is only available up to 1500 grit. To go finer, you'll have to switch to Eagle Abrasive's Bufflex system, and that includes 2000, 2500, and 3000 grit. And once you get to the 3000 grit, the surface is going to be so smooth and so polished that pretty much any hand polishing technique or hand buffing technique is going to bring out that mirror-like shine. If you're wondering what kind of clear coat product I used on this guitar, or maybe you're wondering how it looked after I took it to the buffing machine, you're going to have to wait a couple of days until I post up the next episode of From the Luthier's Workbench. In that episode, I'm going to be talking about the product that I used, and I'm going to be testing it to show you how incredible it is. And then I'll take the guitar to the buffing machine and we'll show you how it looked once I had buffed it up to a high gloss shine. So until that episode, take care, stay safe, and as always, give me a thumbs up for this video. That always helps. And I'll see you soon.